There are times when the past comes crashing into the present, and the results could have quite an impact on the future. That is just what is happening here in the coastside town of Santa Cruz. While other places are tearing down their historical monuments, Santa Cruz is building one of its own. But the question is, will it be presenting real history, or will it be creating a modern mythology? I'm Casey Tefertiller. I have researched and written extensively about Western history. My book, Wyatt Earp, The Life Behind the Legend, was a notable book of the New York Times. I want to tell you about something that has happened in Santa Cruz and how 146 years later it has become the focus of a controversy, and how it could misinform future generations about how we understand our past. Back in April of 1877, the grandest circus ever to visit the Pacific coast was coming to town. It would have trick riders, acrobats, trapeze artists, clowns, and it had an incredible menagerie. It would have a two-horned rhinoceros, the only ever to appear here. It would have a horned horse. Just about everyone in town wanted to attend the circus, especially two ex-convicts who didn't have any money. 31-year-old Francisco Arias and Jose Chamales, 21, felt the buzz of excitement about the circus. So they came up with a plan to try and get funds. That night, they were seen at the circus, visiting the sideshows and munching on goodies. The local police chief wondered how they got the money. The next morning came a gruesome discovery. The body of a 62-year-old carpenter named Henry DeForest was found near the opening of a railroad tunnel. He had been shot and murdered. Sheriff Bob Orton led an investigation that soon centered on the two ex-cons. Orton talked to members of the Native American community and got information. The Native Americans didn't like these guys. They told on them, and they were afraid of them. Orton and Police Chief Robert Lydell received information that the two suspects had traveled to the South County area near Watsonville. They notified the authorities there, and Chamales was soon captured and brought back to town on a train. Orton interrogated Chamales, and he quickly confessed. Then Chamales led the officers to the scene of the crime and reenacted the murder, telling how Arias had done the shooting. By this time, there was a pretty good chance that Chamales would get off with a short sentence. By him confessing and implicating the other man, chances are he'd get a pretty short sentence. Orton soon recaptured Arias and brought him back to Santa Cruz. Chamales requested that they not be placed in the same cell in the small jail. And the next night, on May 2nd, townsmen gathered at a saloon downtown. About midnight, a large group, estimates range from 30 to 350, nobody knows how many people were in the group, marched up the hill and took the two prisoners from the cells and placed them on a wagon. They drove them down the hill to a bridge, gave them one last drink of whiskey before sending them to eternal damnation. When the sun came up the next morning, crowds gathered to stare at the bodies. A photographer came and took a picture. He would then sell copies of it around town for years. Pieces of the rope were sold as souvenirs. That was a common practice during the 19th century. They were believed to be good luck. The horrible event was never forgotten in Santa Cruz. Every decade or so, a local historian would write an article retelling the story. It wasn't until recent years that some folks came up with a whole new spin on this, and that is why this monument will be erected. On September 21st, 2023, the Santa Cruz City Council approved the wording for the monument. It began by saying, "Throughout the United States, lynching of people of color was a form of racial terrorism intended to intimidate people and enforce racial hierarchy and segregation. In California, indigenous people and Mexicans were frequently the targets of this type of racial violence. It concludes by saying, this information is provided in hopes of learning from the past, remembering the victims and confronting racism within our Santa Cruz community. Only when we acknowledge our downfalls as a society can we move to right our wrongs and deconstruct the racial and cultural barriers that can lead to the loss of life, and on and on. But there's a problem with this. No one has ever produced even a scintilla of evidence that racism had anything to do with the lynching. The city will be building a memorial claiming this was a racial lynching without any reason at all to believe that that is the truth. In contrast, there's overwhelming evidence that the lynching had nothing to do with race, that it was a response to the lawlessness gripping the community at the time. So the question becomes, were these two men lynched because of the color of their skin or because of the cruelty in their hearts? Here's what the Santa Cruz Sentinel from the time had to say. The people of Santa Cruz, finding that their lives and property were in danger from the number of murders and robberies that have been committed within this county in the past 8 years, no legal execution having followed. The new trials are granted on technicalities that Arias and Chamales were guilty of the murder beyond a doubt, resolved to hang said Arias and Chamales, that we the taxpayers and conservatives of justice, after due deliberation, we resolved that Arias and Chamales should pay the penalty for their crime. There were 3 local papers at the time. None provided any indication that race played a role in the horrible event. The Santa Cruz Courier ran the headline, "A Double Tragedy." Across the West, there were hundreds of lynchings, the vast majority of them white men. 3 years earlier, a red-bearded Irishman named Matt Tarpey was lynched in nearby neighboring Monterey County after he shot a woman. A Hispanic actually placed a noose around his neck. The most famous lynchings and near lynchings in the West were of white men. The 2 San Francisco vigilance committees were the most famous of lynchings. Wyatt Earp single-handedly stood off a mob to save a young gambler from being lynched. In 1933, there were 2 men lynched in San Jose, even in 1933, in the 20th century. White men were lynched for the same crimes as Hispanics, and Hispanics participated in lynch mobs. Today, we live in such racially sensitive times that we really, really need to be careful to get this right. It is pretty darned important to provide evidence before you brand an act of history as racially motivated, let alone racial terrorism. When a monument is erected, it will be accepted as a truth, whether it is true or not. Future generations of parents will take their children to this marker and reverentially read it, then bemoan the racist sins of American past. The proponents of this marker have provided no evidence whatsoever to support their claim of racism. Scholarly history is done by assembling evidence and presenting a fact-based case. It is not done with whims and gut feelings and assumptions. Let us take a closer look at what happened back in 1877. Both Chamales and Arias had served time in San Quentin prison. Chamales had robbed a Hispanic widow, a California widow, and taken this poor woman's earthly belongings. Arias had a long list of crimes, including participation in a murder. He testified against his brother Vincente and received only 5 years. And that's probably what one of them would have gotten for testifying against the other in this case. After they were captured, word got around that Chamales had reenacted the crime. There could be no real question of guilt. The town had been enduring a crime wave. The Sentinel even advised readers not to visit downtown without carrying a pistol. This murder to get money to attend a circus was so brutal, so horrendous that it horrified the West. One newspaper even editorialized that circuses should be banned rather than lead to further murders. On that fateful night, angry townsmen gathered in a saloon down the hill and began discussing what to do. The leader of the mob and the rabble-rouser was a 25-year-old recent immigrant from Italy. He had been a little ways behind DeForest on that fateful night, few minutes behind, and he then walked the same path. Had he gone ahead of DeForest, he knew that he would have been the target. Rufus Page, a veteran of the U.S. Navy who had fought in the Civil War to free the slaves, tied 5 nooses, and the mob went up the hill with the intention of hanging all 5 prisoners. Now, I need to stop and tell you about someone else who was in the jail. Among them was a man named John Cantwell. He had killed an Indian in a knife fight, and how did Santa Cruz reward this hero of the war on racial terrorism? Did they build him a monument? Did they give him a plaque? No, they threw him in jail where he sat there with Arias and Chamales waiting for the next step. And now this next step was a mob coming up the hill with a noose to hang him where his body could be right next to Arias and Chamales. The jailer, Jackson Silvar, refused to turn over the prisoners. The lynch mob pulled back to reconsider what was going on. They returned and made a compromise offer. They would take Arias and Chamales, then leave the other prisoners alone. Silvar reluctantly accepted. He and 1 deputy could not stand off a mob. Better to save 3 than to lose all. So if the mob planned to lynch Anglos and Hispanics alike, it is hard to imagine that this was racially motivated, let alone part of some campaign of racial terrorism. And let me tell you something else. About a year later, a Norwegian immigrant named Charles Colby walked into the kitchen of a local hotel and murdered the chef. When the talk of another lynch mob began, Orton and Lydell sneaked Colby over the mountain to San Jose to prevent him from being lynched. If the previous lynching had been racial, there would have been no reason to sneak him away. So again, we ask the question, will Santa Cruz be creating a modern mythology? I believe that truth in history is important. In this case, it is particularly important because the monument will be creating racial division without any evidence to back it up. The country is already divided. We do not need further falsehoods to divide us. We study history to learn from the past, and there's an important lesson from the era of lynchings. When residents became fearful and felt unsafe, they took the law into their own hands. They took actions to send a message to the outlaws that crime would not be tolerated. Lynchings were to prevent the next murder. Lynchings are awful. Understand that. They were just terrible. Only a small percentage of the population participated, and very few backed it. Most townsmen considered them abhorrent. It was so disliked that a few years later in a public gathering, the wife of a local minister got to her knees and begged for the end of lynchings in the West. People, just church people, good people in town, abhorred the thought of lynchings. They were just not a popular idea. The Santa Cruz Monument is only the first of a series of lynching monuments that are being planned across the West, attaching the claim that lynchings were motivated by racism. Reinterpreting history can be laudable when it is done with evidence and sound historical methodology. When it is done only with imagination and assumptions, it is nothing more than creating modern mythology to catch a social trend. This only serves to prevent us from an accurate understanding of our past. This is not positive. Thank you for listening.